Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition President and CEO, Liz Schreyer.
Good morning, and welcome to the 2016 State Summit Leadership Summit. After Sunday's tragic events in Florida, I'm thankful to see everyone here. Several of our guests are from Orlando, and our hearts and prayers are with all those that were impacted. We have important work to do, and I am very appreciative that so many of you made the effort to be here. We kick off today with over 500 state leaders from across the country. Now, I want to know how many of you are here at a USGLC event for the first time. Wow, that's fantastic. So who's going to Capitol Hill for the first time? All right, just a few of you. Who is here that came all the way from the West Coast? Well, I'm glad you got here. How about the South? Wonderful. How about the Midwest, my home area? Terrific, welcome. And the Northeast? Hear, hear. A little energy, that's right. Well, welcome to everybody. We are in for 2 incredible days to learn, to network, and of course, to advocate. We have the opportunity to shape America's global future with headliners starting with General David Petraeus to explore a discussion with 5 incredible women who are shaping our international affairs agencies. This afternoon is going to be dominated by Election 2016 with a wildly impressive foreign policy discussion, and of course, our headliner this afternoon, Meet the Press host Chuck Todd. Tomorrow will be the pinnacle of our work as we go up to Capitol Hill with over 200 meetings with our members of Congress. Today, we want to make sure you join the conversation. Join us on Twitter. You can use our hashtag SummitDC as well as our handle USGLC. And we're even going to give an award to the person who tweets the most. So please join in, and it's a good award. So last week, I want to share with you that a CEO of a major organization asked me, with Washington so broken, does our work matter? Now, I'll tell you, I believe it does now more than ever. And I had this conversation with one of our guests just earlier. We sit between 2 very compelling yet challenging narratives. On one end, I don't need to tell this group, a world in turmoil. Threats from ISIS, pandemics like Ebola and Zika, the horrific Syrian refugee crisis, ongoing tensions with Russia, North Korea, Iran, and the list goes on. These are the global complexities, this world in turmoil, that is not lost on members of Congress. But on the other end is the world of politics. This, too, as we know, is in turmoil. And I have to say that our policymakers makes them very nervous. They read the polls. They know and see the anxiety in voters, the inconsistency in the polls, especially on foreign policy. And this is where USGLC steps in. We create the voice, the forum, the convening of creating a space to create and bring these 2 tensions together. To let policymakers know that there is a powerful constituency who believe that America needs to be engaged in the world, who tell the story of how needs to be a strategic investment in development and diplomacy to advance our national interests, to remind America, voters, that America needs to, if we step back, other people will fill that void. And we may not like the direction that it takes. So I travel around the country. I visit a lot of you. And I see the difference you're making. I see the difference when you participate in hundreds of in-district meetings and education forums and meetings with candidates. Like when Billy Canary from Alabama joined me in a meeting with his senator who just happens to be the national security advisor for Donald Trump. So yes, I think it matters. And let me tell you a story about 2 rooms. The first room happened not far from here. It's the Vice President's office in the Capitol, just off the Senate floor. It was last year, and it was the day the Senate voted on the budget. Senator Rand Paul had an amendment to cut 50% of the foreign aid account. I began the day at a Senate hearing, and I was accompanying Admiral Jim Stavridis, who chairs our military group. Senator Lindsey Graham, a great champion from South Carolina, was holding that hearing, and I think Admiral Stavridis is a rock star for us. But all the cameras of the press were focused on the other end of the witness stand, all talking about the importance of foreign assistance, but they were focusing on the witnesses, Bill Gates and the movie star Ben Affleck. After the hearing, we went to that room, to the Vice President's office off the Senate floor, where 25 senators came by to visit with the witnesses. As each senator came in, I had a chance to greet either him or her. And I made a connection telling a story about you. I told Senator Corker and reminded him of the event we held with him in Nashville, Tennessee, or Senator Ayotte about the event we had with her in New Hampshire. I reminded one of them about the veteran that I had just come to visit them with, or I told them about a name of an advisory committee in their hometown. And Admiral Stavridis and I kept remarking about the change that would happen as we made these connections with the senators. One senator even asked me if we could start organizing in her state. And that afternoon, that amendment to cut 50% out of the foreign aid account was defeated 96-4. The second room was so different. Nothing was ornate. There were many broken chairs. The floor was dusty, and I loved every bit of that room. Several months later, I was leading a policy group to Nairobi, Kenya, and we spent the morning walking through the Kibera slums. Poverty literally shakes you to the core. I was walking through a narrow, muddy street where they were tin walls that were making up their home. Hundreds of thousands of people lived in an area where 1.5 square miles, no electricity, no running water. I thought I was going to see sadness, but instead what I saw is smiling children waving at me. And when I exited the slums, I walked into what was their gathering place, their kind of town hall square. It was their cyber cafe. It was a little bitty room. There were six computers that I was told that power outages typically broke down. And there was a kid doing their homework and a woman trying to get her driver's license. The man who owned it, young man named Anyango, showed me his Coca-Cola sign, of course, on the wall, and showed me a painting of the Obamas, which I asked why. And he said because it was out of appreciation because USAID had given them their first grant in order to create the Cyber Cafe. And when I asked why most people came, he smiled and said, because they want to connect. They connect to their Facebook page. I first laughed, and then I smiled. We connected in that Capitol Hill room, and here, hundreds and hundreds and thousands of miles away, people want to connect. USGLC is about connecting. We connect in Capitol Hill, and we connect a world away. If we're going to shape our global impact, we need to lean in, and we need to connect. It's up to us to raise our voices, tell the story of why it matters to Anyango and why we need to give hope to those smiling children, to educate candidates to educate policymakers to speak out. So this is how USGLC connects, and this is how we shape our global impact. I know that when we do, and when we create this space for policymakers who are a little shaken right now, but they know there is a global world that we need to connect to, we can together shape that better, safer, more prosperous world that we all want. And I also know that we at the USGLC are stronger and better when all of you are with us on our journey. So I thank you for being here, not only on these next 2 days, but with us all the way to November and beyond. Thank you for being with us. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Brigadier General John Adams to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you. Good morning. I am retired Brigadier General John Adams, and I'm a proud member of USGLC's 30,000 strong Veterans for Smart Power. I would like to take a moment to recognize the nearly 200 men and women here today who have sacrificed so much in the defense of our national and our most deeply held values. They deserve our appreciation and our support for their service to our nation. I would like to ask all the veterans in the room to please rise so we can salute you. Thank you for helping to make the work we do around the country possible. My experiences as an Army aviator, intelligence officer, and working as the U.S. Deputy Military Representative to NATO have reinforced my conviction that the U.S. cannot remain safe by use of our military power alone. We must remain engaged in the world through robust funding of our diplomatic and development programs. With so many challenges and opportunities facing the U.S. today, we cannot afford to retreat from the global stage. I'm particularly looking forward to our opening discussion today with a very special guest to help us understand at a time of great global crises how America will continue to lead. Someone from whom I had the privilege of learning from as a cadet at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. As a senior cadet, he was the executive officer of my cadet summer training company in 1973. Fast forward to 2006, when he was the commanding general of the Army's Combined Arms Center in Fort Leavenworth. I drew upon his wisdom in preparing an Afghanistan and Iraq lessons learned briefing for our allies. He personally engaged to ensure that the information provided to our allies was the latest and most helpful. It is my honor and privilege to introduce General David Petraeus, a man who requires no introduction, but whose list of accomplishments is far too impressive to go unrecognized. General Petraeus is as accomplished a scholar as he is a soldier, having earned his PhD in International Relations from Princeton University and taught at the U.S. Military Academy. He has changed how we think about the world, especially in combating violent extremism. He's a highly decorated four-star general who served over 37 years in the United States Army, culminating in some of our country's most critical assignments in recent years. Commander of coalition forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, and commander of United States Central Command. After retirement from active duty, he served as director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He serves as member of USGLC's National Security Advisory Council, a group of over 170 retired flag and general officers who support development and diplomacy alongside defense, and has been named on lists ranging from the top global thinkers to the most influential American leaders. Joining General Petraeus on stage today is our distinguished moderator, KT McFarland of Fox News, who will help guide our conversation today. A longtime friend of the USGLC, KT has held national security posts in the Nixon, Ford, and Reagan administrations, and is currently a national security analyst for Fox News. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming General David Petraeus and KT McFarland.
how'd you like that rock star music opening?
Pretty nice,
Pretty
pretty
good,
nice.
isn't it?
And thanks for doing this, KT.
Well, thank you. And General Petraeus, I think as General Adams just said, you know, we're so honored to have you here because you
honor's mine.
really are
Thanks.
not only a military hero, but a man whose opinion on the whole national and global scene is so well respected. The way this is going to work is I'm going to be a Fox News analyst and grill General Petraeus on a few questions.
But without the usual Fox
Well,
News
without
enhanced interrogation techniques.
Well, who told you that? I never promised that. But we would like to hear from you. So if you have any questions for General Petraeus, I encourage you to be like your 12-year-old children are and use the Twitter hashtag SummitDC. So if you want to ask any questions, do it now. Hashtag SummitDC, and we'll get to your questions. General, I'd like to start. Well, actually, I'm going to start by asking the audience a question. Did any of you remember that wonderful movie that always is shown on Christmas, It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart? And the angel, and Jimmy Stewart's very unhappy and depressed, thinks he's been a failure, and his guardian angel comes and says, let me show you what the world would have been like if you had never been born. And all of a sudden, Jimmy Stewart realizes what a difference he's made in people's lives. So I want to ask you that question. I'm your guardian angel, and I'm saying, what would the world look like without America's leadership?
Well, it would look very, very different, obviously. And let me just say up front, first of all, it's great to be with the Global Leadership Coalition. It's wonderful to see all the state leaders of the coalition here in Washington. I would remind each of you that you're in a city where if you want a friend, you should get a dog. On a serious note, this is a great organization, and it's a privilege to be part of it. And of course, the emphasis is on America's role in the world, and that role has to be one of leadership built on a very, very strong economic foundation, needless to say. Look, if there wasn't American leadership in the world, there would not be the norms, the organizing principles, the international organizations, all of this that was built up in the wake of World War II, the monetary and financial elements of the global system, the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations. None of these perfect by any means, but all of them have contributed to a world that, by and large, has enabled other countries and our own to do as well as they possibly could. And the fact is, we see that leadership challenge now in a number of places. Ironically, some of that challenge comes from the country that has benefited the most of any country in the world over the last 2 or 3 decades. That's China, of course, which has enjoyed historically unprecedented growth. And so, again, we should remind other countries that although the systems do need to evolve, and it's a shame our Congress couldn't have changed the IMF voting rights before China got so frustrated that they went out and formed their own institution to do development. But again, these systems have served the world quite well, and they are, by and large, a result of U.S. leadership and then by U.S. engagement in the implementation of how this system has evolved. I might actually just back up for a second because I think it will illustrate something that this organization is all about and ask or really answer a question that I've been asking myself a lot, particularly as we're in a presidential campaign season, and others ask me fairly frequently. And that is a question of what is it that we should have learned from the last 10 or 15 years or so in the Middle East in particular. And I generally think that there are 5 lessons that we should have learned. The first is that ungoverned spaces in the Mideast, Africa, North Africa area, and also Central Asia, ungoverned spaces in these areas will be exploited by Islamic extremists. It's not a question of if, it is only a question of when. Second, the effects of these extremists being active in these locations will not be contained to the area in which they are located, not to the state, not to the region. They will spread over. Syria is the worst example of this, a veritable geopolitical Chernobyl spewing violence, extremism, instability, and a tsunami of refugees into our European allies and causing the worst challenge that they have had in a number of decades, far worse than the Euro crisis. And I come back, I just was in Germany with a number of leaders from Europe. Third is that in responding to these situations, there is absolutely no substitute for American leadership. We have more in terms of the assets that really matter, not just militarily, but in other respects as well. But if you look at just that subset that has been proven so important in the current fight against the Islamic State, the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, drones, manned and unmanned aircraft, precision strike assets, and the ability to do industrial strength intelligence fusion, that's what's required to bring all this together. If you look at those, we have more than all of the possible allies and partners in the world times several orders of magnitude. We've got to be involved. And the truth is, where we are not, the situation tends to get worse. Where we are, there is a prospect that it can get better. But that's if and only if we then embark on a concept, a strategy that is comprehensive in nature. And that speaks to this organization's focus. It has to be more than just a counterterrorism approach. It can't just be drone strikes and raids by Delta Force or SEAL Team 6. It has to be all of the above. It has to be a civil military endeavor with all of the elements that we had in the surge of Iraq, but by no means having to have our ground combat forces on the front lines. We're showing that it's possible to not have to do that in Iraq. And that's critically important because the endeavors we have to be sustainable. And that draws on the last insight, which is, of course, that these are going to be battles of a generation. This is a generational struggle. It is a struggle for the heart of the Muslim world. We should recognize this is far more of a clash within a civilization, the Islamic world, than it is a clash between civilizations, as much as the extremists do try to foment that kind of violence, as we see so tragically take place over this past weekend. So again, these lessons are critical. These spaces will be exploited, the effects won't be contained. In other words, you can't just admire the problem here in Washington until it goes away. You have to do something about it, and American leadership is imperative in doing that. It has to be a comprehensive effort, but we don't have to do all of the different components. And by the way, we should always have as many allies and partners as we can. Winston Churchill was right that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. And we want as many Islamic countries as partners in that effort in particular, because most of our successes against Islamic extremists have come with help from Muslim partners. That's critical, and it's why also the kind of hate speech that we occasionally hear is counterproductive and actually hurts that important effort. And finally, this is going to be a task of a generation. We used to say this is a marathon, not a sprint, about endeavors like Iraq and Afghanistan. It's more than that. This is an ultra-marathon, and we have to be committed to it, which brings us back to why we have to be so efficient and effective in terms especially of our own young men and women casualties and the treasure that we expend on this, and we want to have everyone engaged in it.
You know, when you were talking about allies, you were referring to foreign allies, but you're somebody who's come from the military and the intelligence communities, and yet some of your strongest allies in the whole of government approach were USAID and the State Department.
Well,
can you talk about the...
Sure. I mean, it's far more than that, frankly. It certainly, the State Department provides the leader, if you will, for the military leader. Generally, his counterpart in an effort like Iraq or Afghanistan is going to be the U.S. ambassador, but it can be much, much more than that as well. And of course, under the ambassador, the country team has every element of the U.S. government. At various times, it's been border security forces that we actually wanted, the so-called BORTAX from Customs and Immigration and Department of Homeland Security is hugely important. The Treasury Department has been hugely valuable in a variety of these. The FBI, obviously the intelligence community agencies. So again, this is a matter of everyone pulling together. And certainly, this is much, much more than just trying to kill or capture your way out of an industrial strength problem. That doesn't work. In fact, I said that repeatedly at the outset of Iraq. That's why we fostered reconciliation. We knew we couldn't kill or capture all of the Sunni extremists in Iraq, nor even all of the Shia militia extremists. And we realized that we had to put pressure on their leaders, but we had to reconcile with as many of the rank and file and the sheikhs of the influential tribes as was absolutely possible. And that's why we pursued the reconciliation component that was so important in Iraq in bringing the Sunni Arabs back into the fabric of society, keeping them there for 3.5 years until tragically Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, our partner during the surge, undid what we'd done by highly sectarian actions that inflamed the Sunni population and made them feel alienated once again, as they'd felt prior to the surge and prior to reconciliation.
You know, when you talk about Syria, Iraq, we are where we are. And although there were tragic mistakes made along the way, as you look forward, what should our approach be? Not only to there's a military problem, and let's put that aside for a minute, but the humanitarian crisis, not only in the region, but as the humanitarian crisis spreads to Europe and to other parts of the world.
Well, at the end of the day, you've got to resolve the root problem. I mean, there's a humanitarian crisis because there is a civil war ongoing in Iraq, because there is a Sunni-Shia conflict going on. Civil war in Syria. There's a Sunni-Shia conflict in Iraq. There are tribal and extremists versus others in Libya. Obviously, the Taliban, Haqqani network, and others trying to undo what we've achieved in Afghanistan and so forth and so on. So at the end of the day, you've got to address the root issues, and that requires, again, as I mentioned earlier, very much a civil military comprehensive endeavor, albeit one in which we want the host nation and other countries to do as much as is absolutely possible, so that we may be leading this, we may be guiding it, we may be helping with the overall concepts, the plans, and so forth, but we want others to do as much as is possible on the ground, so we don't end up in a situation where we end up having to commit 165,000 of America's finest men and women, young men and women in particular, most of whom raised their right hand after the 9/11 attacks, knowing that that action would lead them to deployment to a combat zone. Very special individuals who deserve, I believe, the title America's new greatest generation. I will tell you what they will say, though. And how many, again, just out of curiosity, in here have served in Iraq or Afghanistan or any of the other deployments? And thank you so much for what you have done.
Yeah, look around. That's huge.
Let me just, as an aside, though, offer what many of them would have said in response to me offering that particular recognition, that title. They will say that the original, the greatest generation, the World War II generation that saved the world from fascism and so forth, and preserved our democracy and way of life, they will say that they became the greatest generation, not just by what they did on the battlefield, but by what they did after they came home, went back to school in many cases, and then helped build the greatest nation in Earth in the 20th century in the wake of that war. And that's what they're all intent on helping America do now as well, I can assure you.
Well, this audience, as you can see, they already subscribe to that. I mean, that's why you're here today, and that's why you've dedicated this part of your lives to this kind of international and national service. But how do you, that's a heavy lift in some cases for the rest of the country. These people are all going to Capitol Hill tomorrow.
Yep.
What advice do you have for them? How do they make the case that you've just made articulately to a very friendly audience? They may have an audience that isn't so friendly when they start to go up to Capitol Hill.
No, sure, and I think it's understandable that there is frustration with the enormous cost in lives and, again, in treasure of the efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan and other locations in which we've engaged in the post-9/11 period in particular. And it's understandable that there are those who are saying, let's do some nation building at home. Indeed, President Obama emphasized that fact as well, but has, of course, presided over 2 wars for the entire 8 years of his time in office. So I think you come back to what I mentioned earlier, that it's not optional. Again, ungoverned spaces will be exploited by extremists. The effects won't be contained. They will have enormous impact on our country, but even more so perhaps in those countries that are closest to the Mideast and North Africa, our NATO European allies. And again, having just been out there, I can tell you the worry about the impact of the refugee issue on domestic politics. In the UK, in Germany, I mean, Austria nearly had a very highly right-wing politician elected as the president. These are very significant challenges. And again, you've got to go back to the root. You've got to resolve them there. They are difficult, they are intractable, they are going to be the work of a generation, but you've got to do it. And then U.S. leadership is required. The question then is, how can we make it possible for us to sustain this kind of effort over the course of a generation? And that comes back to not having a comprehensive approach in which others are engaged in as much of that as is absolutely possible. Look, I'm convinced we had to do what we did when we did the surge in Iraq, but I also am keenly aware of the cost of that surge to pull Iraq back from the very, very brink, or indeed the early stages of an all-out civil war. And if you think Syria is bad, try it with a larger population that has even more weapons in its society.
So how does the soft power, if you will, how can we employ soft power in other parts of the world? I mean, Iraq, Syria,
well, we are.
The Middle
Sure.
East.
Sure, we're doing that. Now, you know, I heard Liz talk about the hearings, and Lindsey Graham, one of the great figures on Capitol Hill, in my view. You know, we called them the three amigos. It was Senators McCain, Graham, and Lieberman. There was a period during the surge in Iraq in the early stages when it got tougher before it got easier. As I said it would in the confirmation hearing, there was a period where I was afraid they were the only three people left in the U.S. Senate that even supported us. We could have lost that entire policy. Again, regardless of your views on Iraq and all the rest of that, at that time, I think we had to do that, and it did indeed pull that nation back from a civil war that would have been enormously damaging for the Middle East and beyond. They hung with us, and thankfully, you know, we were able to show very significant progress by the time the ambassador and I went back to testify in mid-September of 2007. Had we not had that progress over the final 11 weeks prior to those hearings, it's possible that we could have lost the entire policy and the whole thing been unhinged. Now, the reason I mention him is because he has been a champion of smart power. In fact, I was the poster child for a number of these different hearings, along with Admiral Mullen, the chairman, and a few others, and certainly Admiral Stavridis, for military figures who said, look, we can't do it all. We need other agencies, certainly state AID foremost among them, but also others, to have authorizations and appropriations to allow them to do what they even want to do, but in some cases can't because they do not have the legal underpinnings to allow them to do it. DHS, for example, wanted to do more to help in Iraq, as I recall, and they just didn't have the further appropriations with which to do it, even though they had a massive budget. So, look, the soft power piece does help enormously. Once you've made the security gains, once you've achieved some progress, you have to cement those gains. That's just the foundation. Now, that foundation is critical. Don't try to build on it if you don't have it. But once you have achieved security gains, you cement those by the so-called soft power. I mean, in these situations, you're either spiraling upward. It's not linear. You're spiraling, where one action reinforces another, which reinforces another. So you get a little bit better. You move into the neighborhood. You know, the first big idea is that you can only secure the people by living with them. And so instead of consolidating on big bases, we go back, which is what we were doing, we go back into the neighborhoods. You establish a little bit better security. The people start coming to you with information about who the bad guys are. You have some successful operations. Security gets better. All of a sudden, the people start to move back to their homes. Then a market gets reopened. Then the school is reestablished. Then, by golly, the electrical grid is back on. Then you actually maybe get a medical clinic going. And then you get more security gains because now the people really want to support you, and they are going to enable you to do everything you can in a security way to strengthen that foundation on which these other areas are being erected. And that's the comprehensive, that's the all of the above approach that is necessary. Again, this is about vastly more than just killing or capturing bad guys.
Talk to us. You mentioned.
Although that has to be done, don't get me wrong.
Prerequisite.
We did plenty of that.
We know you did. And we can take one look at you and realize that that is, in fact, the foundation of the success that you've had in the surge. You talked about George Marshall. We didn't talk about George Marshall, but you've been compared to George Marshall and the success the United States had in the Marshall Plan and after World War II. A lot of that was economic development. Can you talk to us
Sure.
about that aspect of it? Not just
Yep.
soft power, military power, but the economic element?
Yep. We actually should be careful with that particular term, Marshall Plan, because an awful lot of people want to have a Marshall Plan for this and a Marshall Plan for that. It's almost a knee-jerk reaction that, okay, what we really need is a Marshall Plan. Don't get me wrong, we do need economic development, but we need to be measured when we are actually looking at these. The reason the Marshall Plan succeeded is because there was an extraordinary pump waiting to be primed in Europe. That pump was human capital. You had educated people who had been in business, who were very, very determined to rebuild. All they needed was some money to rebuild the infrastructure and then to get businesses going. And then again, it just sort of spirals upward once again, where the virtuous cycle just continues, it reinforces itself, and all of a sudden they're making some money. Now they can reinvest it, and it just continues to go. What you've got to do is a very objective analysis of the situation that you're trying to help. The truth is, in Afghanistan, you can't have a Marshall Plan because you don't have the pump to prime. You have 80% illiteracy. I mean, so my point is not to say you don't do economic development, you do. We desperately needed infrastructure, very basic schools and health clinics, very, very basic programs, but we shouldn't confuse those with a Marshall Plan. What we should do is just recognize the value of economic progress, cementing the security gains, and leaving the people to support their new government, their new Afghanistan or their new Iraq, rather than to oppose it or perhaps to tacitly or actively support those who are trying to take it down.
You're somebody known for recognizing military threats and intelligence threats. What do you think the most pressing non-military threats are in the world?
Interestingly, one of the threats right now, I think, that is often overlooked is just the challenge to these existing institutions that I mentioned earlier that have stood the world in good stead. Again, the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations. Again, you can draw a list of their shortcomings that's a mile long. You can also draw a list of their virtues, which are fairly considerable as well. And then the existing norms, the international laws, the World Trade Organization, all of these you can again throw some rocks at, but okay, compared to what? Compared to nothing? Obviously not. You want to have these kinds of bodies to go to rather than going to war. And I see challenges to that in those countries that are indeed challenging that. I think have to examine very carefully their motives, because they should recognize that in some cases they've benefited enormously from that. Beyond that, I'm very concerned about the threats that exist in cyberspace. Whether these are kinetic or non-kinetic, it's hard to say. Sometimes they can actually do physical damage. But the fact is that we as a country are extraordinarily vulnerable, especially when it comes to the industrial operating systems in our electrical grid, our water systems, our financial systems, and so forth. And so those who say blithely that, well, we ought to just hack back against the people that have done the reconnaissance of these systems or something like that, that's a very, very profound decision, because once you start that, it's very unclear where it's going. The fact is you have a situation that's much, much more complex than the fairly simple, largely bipolar nuclear standoff that we had during the Cold War. And we had decades over which the wizards of Armageddon, as they were called, these great nuclear theorists, could develop their very nuanced concepts and theories of nuclear deterrence and mutually assured destruction and all the rest of that. This is going at a breakneck pace. Cyberspace is emerging as a whole new battlefield. And again, we've got to engage in it, but we don't have the benefit of the time that these other, that we had during the establishment, again, of nuclear deterrence theory, because this is just outstripping what we have. We really just only recently got barely workable cybersecurity legislation that really hung fire for several years before we got that. And the fact is, we probably could use more of that. So again, that's a very significant threat as well. And then, I mean, this sounds a tiny bit bizarre, but we've really got to think through what's going to happen when we have the rise of the robots. Now, these are grand issues, but grand issues need attention. We're facing a situation where machines, greater automation, advanced robotics, and the rest are going to take away jobs that are huge employment opportunities right now. I mean, think of the driverless car. Any repetitive task is already largely performed by machines. Think about what happens when those machines can learn, recognizing that there's a machine that actually beat the world grandmaster in Go, this very complex, multi-dimensional Chinese game. So this is going to be, again, a very, very significant development that is actually accelerating. And we've got to figure out, what do we do in our education system to prepare citizens for that future? More importantly, in some respects, what do you do in the emerging markets of the world, where the historic model has always been that you start out as a low-cost labor provider, you gradually evolve to value-added domestic consumption to drive your economy? What happens if there is no more place for low-cost labor provider because robots are performing all those jobs? So again, these are quite lofty issues, but I think these do need more attention than we've given them.
Talk about Africa, because it seems that falls out of all of the normal considerations. The Middle East, we've got Europe, we've got China, the rise of Asia. What about Africa?
Well, Africa potentially is the, quote, next China. If you look at the population, of course it's not. It's many dozens of countries. It's a vast continent and so forth. And it varies enormously in the conditions in the various countries. And I speak now as an individual who's a partner in one of the world's big investment firms, where we just made our first investment in Africa. We own the largest rose grower in the entire world in Ethiopia, a country of 90 million people with decent governance. Yes, it's largely one party, but it's, we think, responsible. We've expanded that firm from 8,000 Ethiopian employees to 12,000, headed to perhaps 16,000. That's 12,000 families for whom we provide education for their kids, health care for their families, and even a soccer league or soccer team and a field to root for. It's awesome. And so you can see the opportunities, but that's because of stability, security, and reasonable governance. And unfortunately, that is not how you would characterize much of what is going on the African continent. It needs everything. You name it. It needs electricity, it needs decent water, it needs decent education facilities. The basics of life, in many cases, just are not there. So a country that is absolutely ripe for all kinds of initiatives, but they have to start in a lot of ways with that basic foundation of security and then decent governance, enabled to capitalize on what often are very, very resource-rich countries.
I'm sure it hasn't escaped your attention that we're in a political environment right now.
Yeah, I don't do domestic politics, but give
well, good. Okay, so we're not going to ask you who you're voting for. But if the next president of the United States gets on the phone and says to you, okay, Petraeus, you've been around, you know intelligence, you know military, you know economics, you know global development, you're the perfect guy, tell me what I need to do in the next 100 days.
Well, that 100 days is going to be hugely important because the president will never have as much momentum as when he or she enters office and tries to capitalize on that support that indeed put the individual in the Oval Office. I actually teach a course that's titled The North American Decades at the Honors College of the City University of New York. It's great fun, seriously bright kids are all on a full ride scholarship, chosen from, I think it's certainly tens of thousands of the City University of New York colleges. And this course came out of the answer to a question that I gave one time in London a few years ago, where I was asked, after the American century, what? And I think the audience expected me to say the Chinese century, or at least the Asian century. And instead I said, after the American century, the North American decades. I think that's what we're in now. And the question I think the next president has to address is, how do you extend the number of S's on that decades? how do you make it another American century, such as we enjoyed in the last century? And the answer is, I think you have to address some serious overarching issues that have been elusive in recent years, that have given Washington this, everyone else's perception of Washington as one of the top 5 national security threats to our country because of its dysfunction. And so I think you've got to address, you have to come to grips with comprehensive immigration reform. I mean, our country is a nation of immigrants. That's what has kept our population dynamic. That's what's given us decent demographic growth. I mean, the other countries of the world, most of them in the developed world, are either in a demographic downturn or in some cases a demographic death spiral. But beyond that, that's what has helped us so much over the years. We've got to come to grips with that. How do we keep the smart people, and how do we have a legal path for citizenship for the unskilled workers that are still such an important component of sectors like agriculture and so on. Second, I think we've got to come to grips with what are the education needs of the future. As I mentioned, the rise of the robots and so forth, the ongoing manufacturing revolution is going to require a whole different skill set and very, very different education basics than what we've had until now. How do we address that issue? How do we come to grips with the debt to GDP ratio? It's nice that it has been coming down in recent years. How do we keep it going down when we know that if there is not attention to entitlements, that they are going to start growing again, and that the debt to GDP ratio will go up? And frankly, what about revenue enhancements as well? How can that be addressed? What about the issue of regulation and American business? I'm in the business community now. There's a very tangible sense. A lot of you probably are small and medium enterprise owners. That regulatory increase has imposed a certain tax. How can you provide the regulation that's needed? And I say this with a wife who's the Assistant Director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and yet not over-regulate to the point that the cost of this is so considerable. How do we invest in our infrastructure? I mean, is anybody really proud to walk through LaGuardia Airport, as Larry Summers always asks us? And as he also notes, at a time when interest rates are 1 or 2%, why can't you be investing in something that will improve productivity in the future? So ironically, rather than, look, we'll sort out the strategy for how to defeat the Islamic State. By the way, we're actually achieving a degree of momentum in that now. I think that Mike Hayden was probably right in the past, 6 or more months ago, when he used to say that the fight is under-resourced and over-regulated. It's now been resourced more effectively, and it's now the application of the rules of engagement is done in a much more efficient and streamlined manner as well. I'm not saying those are going to take care of themselves, but I think that they are starting to be on a trajectory, certainly, especially if we can extend close air support in Afghanistan to our Afghan security force partners the way we did when we were on the front lines with them. And then we took that away. Now it's a little bit going back, but you'll have seen me write about that in recent weeks as well. So again, I think it's about how do you strengthen the economic foundation on which all of American power rests, and that gives us the ability and indeed the responsibility to exercise the leadership that I've discussed here today.
We're now going to turn to our Twitter questions. And we have one from Deacon Groves. He wants to know, why does 2016 seem to be the year of the isolationist?
Well, I think, again, that it is understandable that in the wake of two hugely costly endeavors, Iraq and Afghanistan, and others that have also been very expensive in terms of lives and dollars, that is, again, very, very understandable that the reaction is no more Iraqs, no more Afghanistan's, in the same way that in the past, after every major war the United States has been in after World War II, there was a no more Koreas movement, there was certainly a no more Vietnam movement, there was even a no more Mogadishu moment, no more Beirut moment, actually, at various times. And I think the job of American leadership is to explain, as I've tried to here this morning, that it's not optional. We have to exercise leadership. And by the way, this is not just for the benefit of others. our deployments in other countries around the world are not for their benefit. It's because it's to our net benefit. And by the way, in many cases, it would cost more if we had to bring those forces home and put them in the United States than it costs to have them out there right now because of the subsidies that those countries provide for those deployments. So again, understandable, but something that has to be debated and discussed, and hopefully those who have that kind of thinking can be brought to recognize that it's in our national interest that we engage in the world and help shape the global community in a way that is good for America, good for American business, and indeed good for the businesses of our allies and partners around the world.
One of the things that seems to be different about this national debate than several years ago is that a number of our military, active duty, but as well as retired senior military leaders have come forth and they've talked not just about military solutions, but they've talked about the civilian tools. What's changed? I mean, you really
Well, what's changed is that we have relearned, because a lot of us had learned this before. Before there was Iraq and Afghanistan. In my case, at least, there were the Balkans. Here in Bosnia, for example, it was Haiti. There as a UN Chief of Operations, Central America. In every one of these cases, we realized what the conflicts of the future really are, and we recognize that the desert storms of the world, where somebody lines up his tanks and tries to go at our tanks, is going to be very unlikely, especially after what we did to the Iraqi army, turning it from the third largest in the world into the sixth largest in the space of 100 hours. Nobody's going to want to take us on like that, I don't think. Doesn't mean you don't have to be ready for it. Doesn't mean that you don't have to have frontline capabilities in a whole host of areas. But it does mean that what we're likely to confront are going to be these efforts that we're engaged in, again, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Central Asia, and even indeed, of course, we were helping our Philippine partners as they combated the forces of extremism and terrorism.
Conflict prevention. We've talked a lot about how we've fought wars, but how do we prevent wars? And what role does the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition members, what role do they have in conflict prevention?
Well, I think, again, it's engagement as much as is possible. What you're trying to do is prevent a bad situation from getting worse. Sometimes that's possible, sometimes it is not. I mean, you don't get to choose the leaders of other countries. They're your partner for better or for worse, and you've got to work your way through that. Again, I have had my share of dealings with individuals that, there were challenging days at various times. I think probably Prime Minister Maliki and President Karzai would be the first to acknowledge that they had some difficult meetings at various moments. I mean, as we would go to some of these, on occasion, I would tell my translator, hang on to your seat on this one. I intend to demonstrate the full range of emotions, as we would say. Just translate normally, unless you think I'm actually losing it, in which case I want you to pluck my sleeve and get me back into the acting mode instead of the...
How often did that happen?
Oh, no, it's very sparing. But these are emotional societies, and you have to show that you have, the capacity for emotion as well on occasion.
And everybody here is going to go to Capitol Hill tomorrow, the most dysfunctional. What did you put that as number one on the biggest
Well, I said the city itself.
The city itself.
But certainly there have been challenges on Capitol Hill, to put it mildly.
Well, we're all reeling from what happened in Orlando, and what potentially might have happened in another part of the country. When the national mood is now potentially going to change a lot from what it was 72 hours ago. What advice do you have for people in this room as they go to Capitol Hill tomorrow, where the staffs and the congressmen and the senators, they're not going to want to talk about this stuff. They're going to probably want to talk about terrorism and the threat to the homeland.
Well, I think they're very, very related. Again, this is a moment to pull together as a country. Indeed, it's a moment to pull together in the world as those who celebrate freedom and security and the rights of others to live, to start off. Again, our country has very, very clear basic principles, and I think this is a time to return to those. And that's what we should focus on. we have been an inclusive society. We have welcomed immigrants from around the world. Certainly you should do the background checks. Certainly you should safeguard against individuals who wish us ill. And, by the way, also safeguard against the extremist thinking that has been behind some of these attacks. It's quite apparent. But that, you don't do that, I don't think, by exclusive or hate speech or other types of responses. I think you do that by pulling together. And as I mentioned earlier, our successes against Islamic extremists have typically been either helped or even enabled by Islamic partners, by Muslim partners, Islamic leaders around the world. And this is a time, again, when all should reach out to each other, absolutely denounce the abhorrent action that's taken place, and work together to figure out how it is that we can identify situations like this to the very best of our ability, and how we can make it more difficult for such individuals to get what it is that they've used to kill so many fellow Americans.
You were not directly involved with this, but there was one crisis in the last couple of years that at least us in the media thought would be a crisis, and it wasn't. It was a crisis that wasn't, and that was Ebola. We're now looking at Zika as potentially another crisis. What role does this group have, the United States or the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition, what it represents, in dealing with these non-traditional threats? You talked about cyber,
Sure.
but this would be health issues.
Well, I think actually the Ebola situation offers a case study of American leadership in action. The president decided to take action. He uses the military, which is expeditionary. We became the platform, if you will, on to which you then put the experts, the medical experts, the health sciences experts who can chart out a strategy to help the countries that were afflicted by this to combat it, to train many, many host nation medical leaders to support the development of the kinds of infrastructure and facilities needed to quarantine and so forth. And ultimately, this very whole of government approach succeeded. So again, I think that's a case study that is quite positive and one that shows what can happen. Again, not every situation is going to be as tractable as that one was. There are some intractable ones out there where we're going to have to keep our shoulder to the wheel for longer. But it's a perfect example of what can be done when civil and military all work together as a team and enable the experts in this case to address a very serious crisis, which if not addressed there, we would have addressed in much greater numbers here.
We have a Twitter question from Brian from California. He says, and I'm going to ask this in a very self-interested way, how do we get more women leaders involved in U.S. and strategic U.S. foreign policy decisions?
Well, you know, I think that if you look back on why you've taken certain actions, you know, people ask me, why did I go to West Point, for example? And, you know, I think I just wanted to be like Mike. I admired Mike, if you will. In this case, Mike was the cadets. We lived 7 miles from West Point, so I had plenty of opportunity to observe them. It was the graduates of West Point for whom I had such admiration. It was, you know, my high school soccer coach who had actually coached the national championship team at West Point and was doing our high school for $1 a year. And by the way, we won the championship our senior year. It was Bruce Springsteen's glory days at their finest. My high school math teacher who had been a math professor at West Point. I mean, all of these individuals, my Sunday school teacher who was the ski coach, you can go on and on and on. And I just developed respect and admiration for these individuals and decided, well, you know, maybe I try to be like them. What does that have to do with this? Well, I think the women who are engaged in these endeavors have really got to work hard, and I think, by the way, most of them do. The Michelle Flournoys of the world, those who have been in and out of government, have a very active outreach to try to help others who admire them, other women, and to facilitate for them the opportunities that they had, that they created in some cases for themselves. And so it's about providing a path, it's about providing inspiration, it's about providing example, and it's also about providing encouragement.
I would like to give you the opportunity to have some final thoughts.
Well,
What
look,
advice do you have for everybody here today?
my final thoughts are the way I started out by saying what a privilege it is to be part of this. Second, how grateful I am to be able to talk to the state leaders who are going to take the Hill tomorrow, politely but persistently, who will ensure that our nation's representatives realize that there are people, very important people from their districts who are passionate about doing what we believe is right, which is to make sure that our military doesn't end up going out there without the kind of civilian partners, and vice versa, that our civilian partners aren't out there without, again, the military assets and support that they need. When we do it together, as Ambassador Ryan Crocker, greatest diplomat of his generation, I think, and I were able to partner together to establish, we made a true civil military campaign plan. In fact, I got beat up on it for this endlessly. They keep saying, what's all that civilian crap in your mission statement and your campaign plan? I said, boss, this is a civil military campaign plan. That's how we have to do this. And one of the very big ideas was that we had to integrate the actions of all the elements of the embassy and those working for the ambassador with all of the elements of the U.S. and coalition forces who were working for me. And we embarked on that. We actually occupied offices that shared the same sort of waiting room. We were in each other's offices all the time. We always went to see the Prime Minister together. We actually went so far that we would change chairs in the middle of meetings. So the Prime Minister would sit there. We had a translator here. I'd sit here if it was my meeting, and the ambassador would sit over there. Sometimes I'd say, now, Prime Minister, the ambassador has some things that he needs to raise, and I would literally get up and he'd switch seats just so he knew whose meeting this had now become. That's the kind of partnership that is absolutely vital. That's what works, but it only works if the resources are there for our civilian partners, as they typically have been for our military elements. And so with that, go forth and take the Hill. Thank you very much.
General Petraeus, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome USGLC's co-chairs Carolyn Miles and Sarah Thorne.
Good morning. I want to say a special thank you to General Petraeus. Wasn't that an amazing panel? And so we want to welcome you to one of the most important and impressive plenaries USGLC has ever hosted, A League of Their Own, Shaping America's Global Impact. My name is Sarah Thorne, and I am the Senior Director of Global Government Affairs at Walmart.
And good morning, I'm Carolyn Miles, the CEO and President of Save the Children. And we're both co-chairs of USGLC and really proud of that. And we're here representing 500 businesses and NGOs that really spend all of our time talking about why America needs to be engaged in the world. And we're so glad that you're here and with us to fight for a better, safer world. So thank you. We're also, as Sarah said, really honored to be able to introduce these 5 extraordinary women who are leading 5 agencies within the U.S. government and who are all supported by the International Affairs budget. And I don't know that we've ever had these women together on the stage like this, so this is a little bit groundbreaking, and we're very excited to introduce them.
So often people get lost in the acronyms of Washington. As you're here for the next couple days, you'll hear a lot of them. But the truth is that the International Affairs Program are implemented by a range of outstanding initiatives, levers, if you will, that when used together can advance America's economic security and humanitarian interests in the world. At any different moment, there are different countries with different needs. There are lots of agencies with many core competencies. So people in many countries are still struggling with extreme poverty and the need for economic and humanitarian assistance that the U.S. Agency for International Development provides. And some are on borderline where partnerships with the Millennium Challenge Corporation can help them break through barriers to economic growth.
And some countries are ready for help from the Overseas Development Investment Corporation and from the U.S. Trade Development Agency, which are two other agencies that are going to be represented today. And as so many of you know, oftentimes in many countries around the world, the face of America is represented by our young Peace Corps volunteers. So today, you'll not just hear about their work from these 5 agencies, but you'll meet the 5 amazing women who are leading these agencies, each of whom have remarkable careers as lawyers, as journalists, as businesswomen, and development professionals, and they've decided at this point in their career to give back. So we're really looking forward to welcoming this fantastic group of people for you today.
So our moderator for this all-star panel will be Liz Schreyer, the USGLC President and CEO. So right now I want you to turn your attention to the screen to meet our superstars of the development and diplomacy world, and that we have called In a League of Their Own.
Thank you.
Cool music for cool women. Nice job. Well, welcome to our League of Our Own. And I want to thank not only 5 fabulous friends, but these are the power women that make international development happen. Thank you for being here. But more importantly, thank you for your talent, your dedication, your grit. Because these 5 women, if you don't know them, you're about to see how amazing, amazing they are. So we just heard General Petraeus, and as he outlined the global challenges, and I was listening to it, he talked, we have a lot to get through, so I'm going to just jump right in. He talked about that the military cannot keep us safe alone. And he focused on development and diplomacy is really critical, and the 5 of you lead these programs that help keep us safe. And I'm really taken by diving into that, starting with that nexus between national security and development. So, Gail, I'm going to start with you, because I know that USAID is in the front line of some of the toughest places in the world. And often your development professionals are critical partners for our military. In fact, I remember, I don't know if any of you were there, but a program that you helped organize where then Secretary of Defense Bob Gates sat on a USGLC stage and said, development is a lot cheaper than sending in soldiers. And I know when I talk to military leaders how much they value the USAID partners, and you should be very, very proud. So here's my first question to you. You just got back leading the U.S. delegation to the World Humanitarian Summit. And at a time when there are unprecedented numbers of severe humanitarian crises in the world. I look at Syria, South Sudan, Iraq, Yemen, and I am sure you talked a lot about just the horrific humanitarian crisis, but share with us something hopeful. Did you come back with anything on the world stage that, on that national security, those really tough places in the world, that you said, some good's coming out of it?
Sure. And thanks, Liz and USGLC, and obviously all my friends. We play that music every time we go anywhere together.
We are going to do it now.
And humanitarian response is one area where we often cooperate with DoD. They provide extra lift, keeping AID in the lead, and they're tremendous partners. You know, I think what I came back from the summit with is a couple things. One was extraordinary confidence and respect for the humanitarian workers around the world, including our own in USAID, in our NGO community, from local organizations on the ground who are dealing with more complex and longer-lasting crises than we've ever seen before. I mean, these are people who joined forces, West Africans, Americans, European, other Africans, to fight the first ever Ebola epidemic. And the fact that they are doing as well as they are is extraordinary. The second is the fact of the matter is the first and the fastest face to show up when there's a crisis around the world is the United States. It's our government, it's our NGOs, and that matters. People know that. People remember that. Everywhere I went at the summit, somebody would walk up to me and tell me a story about how the United States had saved their life or saved their mother. So I think there is a lot of hope, but I think the big challenge, just very quickly, is on prevention. We tried to do something in Ethiopia where we have El Nino causing great havoc, where we tried to launch an emergency prevention operation to get enough assistance on the ground to allow farmers to plant. We succeeded. We're not out of the woods yet. But that's our big challenge, is how do we prevent these in the future, and that's all about development.
I'm going to come back on that one. Let me turn to Elizabeth, because OPIC, which some of you may be less familiar with, is providing that development finance to promote economic growth. But I was really surprised at something you taught me, which is that 1/3 of your portfolio is in conflict regions, Afghanistan, Yemen, Mali, which seem to be tough places to get bank loans. So help us understand about how business is investing in a place like Jordan, which is a really important ally, but is struggling so with the Syrian refugee crisis. So how you're building economic growth in conflict zones.
Thank you, Liz, and again, thanks for the opportunity to be here with all of my fabulous colleagues across the development architecture of this country. Yes, you're right. About 1/3 of our portfolio is about $20 billion, and as you know, Liz, our mandate, OPIC's mandate, is to catalyze private sector investment in the service of sustainable economic development, particularly in the poorest countries and the most insecure countries in the world. But Jordan's a great example of that. In that country, we're providing financing and insurance to American investors that are investing in some of the most critical things that country needs. Imagine, this country has got 1 million Syrian refugees. It's one of the most water insecure countries on the planet. They have no power of their own at all. And yet it's American companies, financed by OPIC, that are providing 1/4 of the water getting into Amman, about 1/4 of the power of the entire country. We're doing very important small and medium enterprise lending, thanks to a partnership between AID and ourselves through Jordanian banks that are providing loans to small enterprises that are employing people, some of them Syrian refugees. So I think it's an example of how American capital and American business can really be a powerful force for good. And when I think of Jordan, and I think of the work we're doing, similar work in Iraq, Afghanistan, as you said, Egypt, Tunisia, you name it, it's in a world where America is so often misunderstood. It is incredibly powerful to have American businesses working in partnership with, say, West Bank or Palestinian or Pakistani businesses, financed by a U.S. government agency, investing in the very things those people want most from their own government: clean water, low-income housing, education, healthcare, and clinics. So I find that is where we can help transform our businesses into really powerful ambassadors for the U.S. that are demonstrating the best of American goodwill, intentions, and creativity in solving these world's problems.
So thinking about Best of America, do we have any Peace Corps volunteers in this audience? Terrific. I love it. So Peace Corps is not necessarily something I throw into a question about national security, but Carrie, I'm going to. Because you're all over the world, including in some challenging places. And so safety is a huge issue, I know, for you. And so I want to throw it in here because I want to ask you, how do you protect your volunteers when it does end up in a place that turns to conflict and struggle?
Great question, and thanks again, Liz, for pulling this all together. And thanks to all of you for being here and for being such great advocates for what we do. First of all, let me start by saying that safety and security and health of our volunteers is absolutely our number one priority. If our volunteers aren't safe and they're not healthy, they can't do their important work on the ground. So we spend a lot of time thinking about safety and security. We have an infrastructure that supports volunteers both at the country level, the regional level, and back here at headquarters. These are trained security professionals. We spend a lot of time training our volunteers and our staff on how to identify risk, how to manage risk, how to prepare yourself with skills you needed, and to work with basically everyone to make safety and security their number one job. But the most important partner in safety and security is the volunteer, his or herself. Their ability to learn the language, understand the culture, and integrate into their community is absolutely key to their own safety. It is their understanding of the language and culture and their knowledge base within the community is both what makes them effective agents of change at the community level, but it also enables them to live safely within the community and to be accepted so that the community itself feels incentivized to protect them. That has been our model for 55 years. It is a very effective model. Our volunteers are almost never harmed within their community. Any harm that comes to them, which is usually petty crime, always happens, or most always happens when they step outside their villages. They are beloved in their community. They are protected by their community because they are part of the community.
Because they're part of it. So fascinating. So let me switch here. This is, as I said earlier, an election year. So as the saying goes, it's the economy, stupid. So I think we should switch to the economy because all of you are going to go to the Hill tomorrow. And I think the reason that this panel is so important and powerful is as you listen to this, think about the stories of success that you're beginning to hear. And earlier in this administration, the president, and Gail was a key member of putting this together, created the Presidential Directive on Global Development. What was the purpose of our global development? And the key was promoting economic growth and key in fighting global poverty. And Dana, you're running an agency, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, who established a groundbreaking model in how we do development with the purpose of promoting economic development by trying to break down some of the barriers. And so my question is it working? Yeah. And maybe you could take one. I mean, I think about Ghana and what you're doing with Power Africa to bring energy and power, and a lot of you, Gail's part of it at USAID, Lee is, actually all of you are part of Power Africa. But why don't I start with you, Dana? Is the model working?
Thank you. Thank you, Liz.
And welcome. I know you haven't been feeling so well.
That's
You got
right.
your tea here, so I'm particularly pleased to have all of you.
Thank you. I will try not to cough in the midst of this. So first of all, thank you all for being here and for the important work that you're doing to go to Capitol Hill tomorrow to talk about this. Absolutely right. So MCC, each one of these programs is unique in their own way, and MCC's space is to take the long view, to look through grant assistance and to promote economic growth. And there are a couple of unique features there. One, it is competitive, so countries actually compete for assistance. Two, it works very closely with both the private sector and the government as well as civil society in implementing under a very country-owned model. And then three, MCC is always looking at the data, and we're looking at how we can think about what is the binding impediment to growth. Oftentimes there are many, but how can we be most strategic and catalytic in an investment? So our investments are over a 5-year period. We know that this is a long game. We know that bringing growth and really addressing the root causes of poverty does not happen overnight. And we're invested in things like energy, and under USAID is leading the Power Africa initiative. precisely because we can't bring growth to the continent of Africa without the basics of turning on the lights. Kids can't study, hospitals can't function, and we all know that the manufacturing and the ability to generate any sort of value add and productivity is severely constrained. So the Power Africa initiative is a fantastic effort that we're all supporting in different ways. MCC's commitment in those countries that meet the criteria is to really look at the sector. Oftentimes the utility is the public good in the sector, and there's private capital willing to go into generation, but not the utility. So MCC is investing $500 million in Ghana to turn around the utility, to undertake the reforms that are necessary to make that sustainable. And really to say, how can we leverage another billion, actually $4 billion in the case of Ghana, under private investment to make that happen. So the economic growth space, I think there's a consensus that that really is, in the long run, what we're going to need to do to address poverty. MCC's results thus far have been very compelling in that regard. We've been in about 25 countries working just for the last 12 years. But I think really if we look beyond the project and we look at reforms and how we incentivize reforms is the place where we can be effective.
That's great. That's great. Let me bring in Lee. You run the Trade and Development Agency, the smallest but one of the mightiest, and a lot of you have met Lee, because Lee has done, I think, the most traveling on the stage. Many of you on the stage, many of you have traveled with us, but you've been out there educating our community, and you've made the case of connecting America's engagement overseas to creating jobs here in the U.S. And a lot of policymakers get stuck on that and get stuck on how that happens. So help us make that connection of how engagement in trade and development overseas makes America stronger economically.
Thank you. I'd love to. But speaking of traveling with USGLC, General Petraeus opened up this morning and said to everyone, "This is Washington. If you're looking for a friend, get a dog." Well, my advice is, if you're looking for a friend of development, go to USGLC. So if we could give USGLC a round of applause for everything that they've done. Thank you. Well done. Well done. And absolutely, I think the model that USTDA employs is really the model of development of the future. It really is a win-win. What we do is we focus on economic development abroad, but at the same time creating jobs here at home, both with respect to goods and services. And I have to say, it really works incredibly well. And we earlier mentioned conflict zones. I just returned from Rwanda, and there's just an amazing story there, both with respect to Power Africa and coming out of a conflict region. USTDA funded an early project planning for a project in Rwanda. One of the parties that's been doing the work with that project is a hydro project focusing on energy, is a company from Denver. When I went with USGLC to Denver, I met with that company. They could not have been prouder of the work that they were doing in Rwanda. I just went and participated in the WEF in Rwanda and met with the project sponsor, and they too are so excited. What this project is going to do is it is going to provide energy for a village in Rwanda from a hydroelectric power plant, which will provide energy for the village, the schools, but probably even more importantly, a hospital. So this clearly is a win-win situation. It's creating jobs, opportunity, economic development in a former conflict zone. At the same time, you have U.S. businesses that are part of it and proud of it. And I have to say, last year alone, USTDA generated over $12 billion in U.S. exports of goods and services. That supports 65,000 jobs here at home. So this clearly is the model: public-private partnership, working together for development, and seeing that there's a win-win situation for all.
Right, I want Lee to come on my Hill meetings with me. Gail, one of the really exciting programs that USAID has done over the last few years is Feed the Future. And you've helped lift 7 million small shareholder farmers out of poverty. And one of the elements of it has been engaging the private sector by in your effort. And I wonder if you can talk, kind of tying this economic thread in, about how important is the partnership with the private sector in the work of USAID?
Thanks. It's absolutely critical because there was an agreement struck last July that the entire world signed on to, but nobody more enthusiastically than developing countries. And it's a simple thesis that if you want to get sustainable development outcomes and really sustained inclusive economic growth, you need assistance, you need domestic resources, governments have to put skin in the game themselves, and you need private capital. And I think all of us together are thinking that way and think, how can we blend these kinds of finance? In Feed the Future, it's made a huge difference, and not just as a very nice project or one-off. In Ethiopia, the government and DuPont are working together to improve maize varieties. So the productivity is higher, the ability to withstand drought is greater. We have a project under Feed the Future in Central America, which is a coffee farmer resilience project with a number of coffee companies. Pretty sure that whatever you drank this morning was represented in that project. A simple thing, how do they reduce the vulnerability of coffee farmers to external shocks? Starting in particular with diseases that affect coffee plants. And by binding together, they do a couple things. They improve the lives of smallholder farmers. They reduce the volatility that comes when there is an external shock. And they get a more sustainable supply chain for their businesses. So, as you rightly say, it's a win-win, but it's something that's enabled us to take agriculture, which is the backbone and the livelihood of the majority of poor people around the world, and put it back on the world's agenda, because you can imagine getting at it in any number of ways, through business, through research, through science.
You know, it's so fascinating listening to all of you, but just what you were talking, it's so different than the old model of development. And if we were, if we had been sitting around here 5-10 years ago, we would be having a very different conversation. And so, Elizabeth, I want to ask you, we're not the only players around here. And when I went to Africa last, you see China everywhere. And given the competition, they have their own development finance bank. Should America be concerned about the competition out there? And I look at an agency like OPIC that maybe could be doing more. And I know you've talked about a lot that. So tell me about the competition out there. Are we doing enough with our development financing?
Thank you for that question, Liz. So certainly I think we could be doing a lot more because, frankly, we're too small relative to others that are out there. When you look at the work that we do, of course, we make loans and provide insurance to U.S. companies who are investing capital in critical infrastructure in these markets. And when we do that, of course, those investments help advance development, advance foreign policy, advance national security. It also helps those businesses gain footholds in these fast-growing emerging markets. Oh, and at the end, because we charge fees for all of our services, we end up generating income every single year for the taxpayer. So for 37 years, we've provided money back to the taxpayer, back to the 150 account. So for example, last year, I think it was some $400 million we contributed. So every dollar into our little model generates about 6 back out. So from that perspective, this economic model is working, but it's still far too small. You know, with only 400 staff, we're actually smaller than the Dutch equivalent.
Wow. And
our economy in the U.S. is a little bit bigger than the Netherlands. So it just doesn't make sense to have something that's undersized, and I know all of us feel that way in different ways, relative to the need and to the opportunity.
No, all of you are really small compared to other countries.
Well, especially if you think about China, as you said in the beginning, China is adding to its development institution, its OPIC equivalent, more than 500 staff every year. And we start with only 400, including contractors. So, yes, our development architecture for the most part, is undersized, under-resourced, and doesn't have exactly the right instruments we need to do the job as well as we could. And frankly, if the model we have is generating income back to the Treasury, why not do more of that?
So we're going to take some questions from the audience, and let me do one quick round on something that I think is really at the cutting edge that all of you have been involved in, and that's on innovation. And a few years ago, going back to 2010, we had a kind of similar panel, but one of, Gail, your predecessor, Raj Shah, was here, and the question was asked, what is something that's on the horizon? And his answer was mobile technology, which is funny that we think about it here, but at the time, it was really quite interesting. And he said mobile tech, and your watch, and it's going to change banking, and it's going to change farming, and it's going to change health. And here we are, and we kind of laugh thinking, well, of course, now we think of it. So I want to think about what is the innovation. And Carrie, I want to start with you, because you have innovated and transformed Peace Corps. You have changed even how people apply, changing 70% the number of people who are now applied. Tell us about what you've done in Peace Corps. It's remarkable.
Well, thanks. Yes, we're very proud of it. We are currently undertaking the largest reform effort the Peace Corps has ever undertaken, and we are using innovative methodologies across the board to improve the quality of our support to volunteers, but maybe even more importantly, the quality of the work that they deliver at the ground level. We're proud of our application numbers, 40-year high. But what I really want to talk about actually is innovation on the ground. And in particular, how we are working in strategic partnership with others, including all of these agencies here. And let me just give you a quick example from our work in Senegal with the President's Malaria Initiative. Our volunteers, as you all know, are catalysts of community-led change. We're at the last mile where things fall apart if they're going to fall apart. And there's a volunteer, Ian Hennessy, was working in Kédougou, which is the southeastern corner of Senegal. Terrible problem with malaria, and they had just completed a BedNet distribution initiative when the niece of his very closest friend and team lead of their small little group of community health workers, his 4-year-old niece died of cerebral malaria. And it was heartbreaking, heartbreaking. And it really pointed to the need to do more than BedNets. Malaria was endemic. It was a way of life. People just lived with malaria, and so there was a latent reservoir of malaria that was just there and reinfecting people, basically. So he brought the group together, and they thought about how they could address this latent malaria, and they came up with an idea of doing what is now called proactive case detection and treatment. They wanted to go to each household in their little community of 500 families every week to talk to people about the signs and symptoms of malaria. If they had a symptom of malaria, headache, nausea, fever, then using rapid diagnostic test kits, which were available already to the community health workers, they would test them and then treat them on the spot. If it was simple malaria, if it was severe malaria, they accompanied them to the hospital. They were already previously trained, but they had had a very passive approach. They waited for people to come to the clinic, and this was a proactive case. So they took it to the National Malaria Control Program. They were very interested, but they said, you know, that works in a village of 500. It won't work for millions of people. But we said, let's just try it in Ian's village. So the Centers for Disease Control did a case control study of another village 11 miles away with similar malaria incidence rates and BedNet coverage rates. And what they found after one season of malaria, rainy season, was a 90% decrease in malaria initiative using a proactive case detection treatment approach. We have now, over the past 5 years, scaled it up using Peace Corps volunteers, community health workers, all trained by that initial cadre, and then increasing numbers because it's a cascade approach now. Our latest trial, 1.45 million people, involving tens of thousands of community health workers, involving only 17 Peace Corps volunteers. And what we saw at that latest one with 1.45 million people was a decrease in malaria incidence in comparison to the control area of 85%. It has changed the face of malaria, community-based malaria diagnosis.
With the lead of Peace Corps and partnerships with others.
But what was at the heart was volunteers working collaboratively with communities that already knew the solution but wouldn't have gotten the leverage to be able to take that any farther than their own community.
Phenomenal.
Yeah.
Dana, after 10 years of the MCC's birth, you led a strategy to say, what are we doing well? What do we need to change? What's our future? Give us one innovation that's really making a difference.
So I would focus on incentives. MCC was founded to incentivize good governance, so corruption and the others, and principles. And we're now looking at how do we think about incentives going forward.
Which is really important to members of Congress, so listen.
Yes. So accountability and rigor are hallmarks of the MCC model. And the incentive structure has always been present with respect to selection. Countries compete based upon objective indicators. They need to pass a corruption hurdle. They need to pass a democracy hurdle. So incentives going forward, we have large-scale grants, and we have the ability to bring to scale ideas. And we're looking very much at, for example, outcome-based financing, pay for results. And I'll give you Morocco as an example. So this is an area where we would just pay for success. We would just pay for the achievement of the objective. We're looking at education. So if girls excel in school, if they meet the performance marks, if they are actually placed in job market, that would be pay for results. And that would be part of the program that we're funding there. So MCC is looking continually at how we can think about incentive structures, either from the policy side or from the actual program side itself. I think you'll see us looking in other contexts to see how we can do pay for results types of programs, and then continue to think about how we can incentivize the underlying governance criteria that are at the heart of MCC in corruption and in other areas.
That's great. Let me get two more in before we go to Lee. You work with a lot of cutting-edge businesses that are doing some pretty neat things. Tell us one.
I was going to say, it's really an exciting area right now, and you mentioned IT before.
Yeah.
And right now, the cutting edge thing is connecting IT with infrastructure. How those two can get together to be smarter. The other thing is, I have to say, our agency consistently, with respect to its surveys, with respect to its employees, has been at the top of the agencies of our size with respect to innovation. So I'm learning that from my staff all the time. But the other thing, especially with Power Africa, looking at renewables, energy storage. Yeah. We are sort of working with a number of people on energy storage. It's going to revolutionize energy in the future.
Great. And Gail, you have probably the most innovative model, the Global Development Lab, that is investing in putting out challenges. I still remember reading about the Ebola effort that got a fashion designer connected to DuPont to make better suits for the
lightweight Ebola suit.
Lightweight Ebola. So what's the innovation that 5 years from now we can say, I heard it first from Gail Smith sitting on the USGLC stage? Here's
the challenge. There's so many. I'm going to do it too. I would agree. I think it's probably going to be in energy.
Okay.
But I think the other thing it's going to be is scale.
Scale.
And that's the game changer.
Yeah.
If you look at global health around the world, we are the world's leader. There are millions and millions of people around the world who are alive because of what we've done. It's been bipartisan, in fact, nonpartisan. It's gotten to the point where we are strengthening health systems. Governments are asking for technical assistance so that they can develop their tax systems and pay for their own health budgets. That's how it should work, right? So in innovation, I think it's combining what is new, what is coming out of the lab, for example, in terms of models for financing, small scale all the way to big scale, connections to creators, entrepreneurs, and inventors, over 10,000 forged already, and then the actual solutions. The challenge, but I would take it more as an opportunity. Imagine the United States using all the pipes that we control or are the lead donor to, using our convening power, our world leadership, to say on any of the kinds of innovations any of us are working on, we can take it to scale and change the world.
It'd be pretty amazing. Let's take both of these two questions, and then whoever it comes to or whoever wants to answer can. Please introduce yourself. No statements, just questions, so we can get as many in as possible.
Thank you very much. My name's Peter Kranstover, and I'm a Peace Corps volunteer of many years ago, and then about 30 years with USAID, Pakistan being my last posting.
Welcome, Peter.
Thanks so much. We all here, and I've been in that experience able to see a lot of the results and great things that we've been able to accomplish overseas in terms of economic development and diplomacy. But we oftentimes hear about conflicts and all of the bad things that are happening around here. And in my retirement status, I give talks in southeast Wisconsin on occasion. And I'd like to hear from anybody up there on the stage about some of the larger global trends that we might be able to mention. And in any kind of public forum that we have, certainly for people who happily happen to be interested in this particular issue. Having global poverty is one of the things that we talk about, certainly, but anything else, and I'll
So a good tidbit to take to the Hill about a positive global trend that is working.
Right.
Terrific. Thank you, Peter. And this gentleman.
I'm Brent Boydston from Colorado. Glad I didn't have to go first. In the developing
The bar
world,
gets raised for the second guy.
it's the tan suits. In the developing world, much of the agricultural and food production is handled by women. How can we in U.S. agriculture assist them in increasing production while reducing burdens?
All right. Do you want to get the second one? And who wants to get the global trend?
I'll do one.
Global trend. Elizabeth. Quick responses. Okay. Go ahead,
quick
Gail.
response on ag, and we've set up something called the Women in Agriculture Index. We'll have new data coming out in September. It's a few things. It's giving them the training and the tools that they need, but it's also getting to rights. Because they've got to have land rights, they've got to have the ability to
Huge issue.
get a loan and manage a loan. We're seeing some progress on it, but I think those are the game changers.
Yep. Elizabeth, you had a trend?
So I would just, on the global trends, I would say for me the most positive, and I think Lee alluded to it earlier, is renewable energy. If you think about it, Africa added more renewable energy in 2014 than in the 15 years previously combined. We're now able to get energy at a village level through off-grid solar in a way that was never conceivable before. That's the first thing. The second part of it, I would say, is the fact that the private sector business is now investing in things that were unthinkable before. 20 years ago, whether it's power, whether it's healthcare, whether it's private education, all of it was funded by government budgets or by donors. And today, private businesses are willing and interested in investing in all those critical sectors, provided they have a little bit of support from organizations.
Can I just jump in on the global trend? And I think it's one that exists, but we have to continue to create. And that's development in a sustainable way. The question was asked earlier about China and its method of development, which is to come in, build something, leave their people there, not help people with capacity building, not help train people how to take care of it. That's the difference with the people up here, and the difference with the private sector. We go in for sustainable development. We help with the capacity building. When we leave, yes, there's infrastructure, but there are also people who know what to do with that infrastructure. And that's the trend we have to continue to create.
Did either one?
No, I mean, on the private sector, I just can't underscore that enough, because all of us use these words and catalytic and leverage, and what do we mean by that? We mean that we recognize that development dollars are flat and whereas 20 years ago they would be 60% plus of capital flowing into these countries for development. Now it's less than 10%. So effectiveness for all of us is how do we think about using either financing or grant dollars in innovative ways, and I agree with you that innovative financing, be it pay for results, be it something like that, so that we can produce outsized impact. Because as all of you know who've traveled, the need is enormous. We have poverty reduction at our core. And so our day jobs and our teams every day are thinking about how do we leverage, how do we catalyze, how do we produce outsized impact.
Right. Yes, please. Wait, no, sir. There's somebody at the microphone.
Thank
you can feel free to go over there. Yes, the woman in the white.
Yes, I'm Janet Robinson Alterman. I'm from Charleston, South Carolina. I'm a proud former volunteer in Afghanistan, former country director in Swaziland, and for 6 years I was the liaison between Peace Corps and AID here in Washington.
Wow. Thank you for your come up on stage.
Actually, I'd love to. Here's my question, and you touched on it with
another power
woman. What I want to ask is, back in the 90s when I last worked in the development arena, the whole concept of women in development and the emphasis on women was more of a silo than something that was integrated through programs. Where are you now with that in terms of emphasizing the education and empowerment of women?
Okay, great question. And let's take one more question over here.
Hi, my name is Evelyn Boyd Simmons, and I work for AfriCare. Hey, Liz. And I started out life as a volunteer with AfriCare and then worked on the Hill, worked at the State Department, worked for corporations, and now am back at in the NGO sector for the first time. So I've sort of seen it from all sides. And I'm wondering, what is the role of NGOs? What niche do they fill for you in that last mile? We often work very closely with women who are often on the front lines of making sure that implementation and knowledge transfer occurs.
Right.
But I haven't heard anybody say what role their partnership with NGOs plays.
You don't get to answer both questions, so you get to pick one. All right.
Probably do more with NGOs.
Okay, you want to do NGOs?
Yeah.
Okay, and then some of you get the women one.
NGOs are vital partners, I think, for all of us. We wouldn't be able to do what we're doing without them. And one of the tidbits you should carry around with you is that the American people invest billions of dollars every year of their own accord in development through NGOs. So in almost every project that we work on, there is an NGO component. Importantly, though, there are also local NGO components. And I think this is one of the things that's key to the sustainability that Lee describes.
Yeah.
We are working more through local counterparts. We deliberately are increasing that, but also building that capacity, because the idea, Lee, as you alluded to, is that we build capacity, we invest in the human potential, and then we get out of the way. So I would say it's vital across the board.
Carrie.
Yes. Thank you for your question about girls' education. Thank you for your volunteer service. I think one thing I want to say is that one of the most important impacts of Peace Corps is the development of American globally competent leaders, and many of you are representatives of that particular fact. What I want to highlight is the whole of government Let Girls Learn, which is our government's commitment to girls' education. It's championed by the First Lady, Michelle Obama. And I think many of us know the facts that a girl who is educated when she grows up will earn more money, will be healthier herself, is less likely to be a victim of domestic violence, will contribute more actively in civic engagement. Her children will be healthier and better educated. When you educate a woman, you educate the world. The development impact of an investment in girls' education is probably the highest return on investment than any other investment in development. So with that in mind, Let Girls Learn is a program that involves most of the agencies here. It's really geared towards reducing the barriers to girls' education for 62 million girls around the world.
Dana, I know you want to add on gender.
Just really quickly, I would underscore the importance of data, gender data specifically, to integrate. So absolutely, get out of the silo. How do we integrate across? At MCC, that looks like, in our cost-benefits analysis, these are data poor environments generally, but us either incentivizing or doing the research ourselves to understand what the gender data looks like for our beneficiary pool. And there are a number of important data initiatives, Gender 2X and others, or Data 2X, pardon me, that's the cold medicine.
Gender 2X, good idea.
That one might be coming online soon. But as we look at what are the ways for us to put women, because we know that economic development comes, from all the data it will show us when women have a meaningful role in participation, we realize that the paucity of data and gender-specific data is one of the inhibitors there, and we're really focusing on that area.
Let me get to this gentleman.
Thank you, Liz, for your presentation back in October at Chicago Hilton, because this is what compelled me to be here today and volunteer my time.
We're glad you're here.
As a 37-year professor at Taylor Graduate School of Management from Illinois, I've developed an academic training and development program which I know it works because I've taken it to at least 12 countries around the world. And I know that it works because the second time that I go back, they tell me, Dr. Caleras, let us show you how much we've improved between the last time that you were here and now. I have the prospectus of it. I'd love to share it with you.
I'll be glad to take a look. Do you have a question or just want me to?
Just to submit.
Okay, I'll look at it after this program.
You.
Thank you. Question from here.
Good morning. My name is Carol Bengor. I was born in Sierra Leone and I live in New Jersey now. And my question is regarding the Ebola orphans in Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. what's next in ensuring that their basic needs are being met?
Thank you
in
for that
terms of-
question. Thank you. And a question here?
Morning, ladies.
Wait, we can't hear you.
Morning, my name is Sarah Grant. I'm just coming off active duty in the Marine Corps, and my sister was actually a Peace Corps volunteer, so both sides.
Thank you to both of you.
My question is, how well are we doing in our investment and our aid in dealing with the effects of climate change and projecting forward to what when we're talking about sustainable development and investment, are we doing a good job of projecting worst case scenario, how to build around potential effects of climate change, particularly in the most vulnerable regions?
Okay. Thank you. So Ebola and Sierra Leone.
Thanks for asking that, because the struggle against Ebola is not over. And one of the very important points we have been making, even as we deal now with Zika and yellow fever and other things, is we can't conclude that just because the raging epidemic has stopped that the after effects have. And one that you rightly point out is the huge number of Ebola orphans. We're also tracking what is happening to Ebola survivors. There's never been this large a number of Ebola survivors, and we're finding that they've got enormous health challenges and face a problem not dissimilar to what the orphans face, is that tragically, survivors and the heroes that worked on burial teams are finding it very difficult to find jobs, to go back to their villages in some cases because of fear. So we're trying to approach that in a number of ways. One, working importantly with our NGO partners on investing in projects that people in West Africa of their own accord are starting to take in orphans. Ideally, we will not be able to do this entirely. We can avoid settings where they're just huge Ebola orphanages, but we can support communities that have taken upon themselves. Interestingly, a lot of the people who were healthcare workers have decided to take orphans into their own homes. So we're looking right now at the kind of short and medium-term responses, but one of the things we're doing with our partners out there is figuring out what are the long-term repercussions of this epidemic and how do we need to invest not only in preventing its recurrence, but getting the job really done for the people who survived. And thank you for asking that.
Thank you.
I'd like to add to that while it may seem unlikely, I'm actually leading a post-Ebola investor trip next month, and it was extraordinary
which
because
is huge.
Thank you.
It's really important.
We need foreign direct investments to rebuild the infrastructure, to create jobs, to rebuild those economies in that region. And I was shocked when we invited 7 different investors, major investors, to accompany me to Sierra Leone and Liberia next month. All 7 of them didn't bat an eye and said yes.
That's great.
So I'll be leading that trip at the end of the month. The second thing I wanted to say on the climate change front is I think, as Lee mentioned earlier, Power Africa is directly at that problem. And I think it's been an extraordinary display of how our agencies can work very seamlessly together against a very important mission. I mean, we are in the process of transforming the global economy in developing countries into one that is more equitable, cleaner, less polluting, more inclusive, and less expensive. And we're doing it in many, many ways. So Power Africa has been huge. We've coordinated well. OPIC ourselves has grown our renewable energy portfolio 100-fold under the Obama administration. We're now doing about $1.5 billion a year in financing on-grid, off-grid, wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, you name it. So this climate change agenda is central to the President's development focus.
Did you want to get in on climate change?
I'm going to jump in quickly on climate change to follow up on Power Africa, but also just the mitigation, the effects of climate change. Clearly, we're at the beginning of a process, so we've been involved in climate change, energy for a long time, but also flood forecasting, emergency management, et cetera. All those things are so necessary, especially in sort of the countries that we all work in. And one other thing, when we talk about women and we talk about girls, we can't forget about also training them about leadership. That there's an important part to education, but it's also training women to be leaders. And that's so important as well in what we're doing.
So I couldn't agree more. I'm going to apologize for the few people that are standing waiting in line and invite you to come up as soon as we're finished to ask any of the last questions. So I'm going to take the privilege of the moderator to actually ask the last question. So I apologize. But I happen to notice something unique about our panel. And it's what Lee just said. You're all very powerful leaders and women. So my last question has to do with our title of this program, which is a little play of a movie some time ago, A League of Our Own. And I want to ask you to reflect, if I could, that each of you come from extraordinary careers. As we said in the introduction, some of you are journalists, you're businesswomen, you're philanthropists, you're lawyers, you've done it all. And you've all chosen, at this point in your career, to devote yourself to the public sector and to development and to diplomacy. And I would love you to share, if we had time, I'd ask you a lot of questions, but we don't have too much time. But perhaps one inspirational point in your life that led you to this moment, to picking this point of why you did it, to leave us to a little insight into who you are, so that we can get to know you just a little bit better. I know how extraordinary you are. And I'll start in the center. Elizabeth.
Well, thank you for that.
And unfortunately, you have to be short. This is the Sunday morning talk show where you have to be short. So Elizabeth.
First of all, it's a huge privilege to share the stage with you fabulous women to my left and my right. So that's a huge honor for me. I would say my inspiration, I first went to West Africa in the late 80s and had the privilege of living there, setting up greenfield microfinance institutions during the time. And I think it was a woman that I met, one of the first clients I ever made an actual loan to, and her name was Aminata. And she had 7 children, and her job was buying tomato paste in a huge vat every day and selling it by the spoonful. And when I made her that loan, her objective was to buy more vats and sell more and maybe get her daughters to help her. And when you asked her why she wanted to grow her business and take that loan, all she wanted was to put her daughters in school and make sure they went to school. And extraordinarily enough, 5 years later, I was actually back in Mali again, looked her up on the microfinance loan officer schedule, and sure enough, there she was 5 years later, no longer with a dirt floor, no longer with a plastic roof on her house, and all 6 of her children at that time were in primary and secondary school.
Fantastic.
So that's the kind of woman that I find incredibly inspiring, who's really putting education first. It teaches us that microfinance, for example, doesn't get people out of poverty in the first generation, but it sure does in the second generation, especially when it's focused on girls' empowerment.
Fantastic. Thank you for being here. Lee.
I have to say that I've been inspired by everyone around me, but I've also been very fortunate to have an amazing family that believes in people being professionals, but also believes in public service. My sister is amazing, and she is a math coach and a very difficult school system. My brother is a principal and does amazing work. So we've been always encouraged by our parents to get the highest education we possibly can, but at some point in our life to give back. So I'm pleased to be able to have that opportunity now.
Well, the country is very lucky that your family has done that. Thank you. Dana.
Goodness. So it's commencement season, and I was actually on campus at UCLA yesterday, and
Your alma mater?
My alma mater, and I have to say my experience was, and I encourage all of the parents out there, and I think about this now that I have teenage boys. I studied in Jerusalem my junior year of college, and it was 1987 to date myself, and Jerusalem was teeming with passion, as it always is, and violence, and the start of the Intifada. And it really instilled in me a love, a quest, a sort of idea to look for meaning that's greater than an individual, be it in peace and security, in development, in international affairs. It's an impressionable time of life, obviously, at that age, but really I was struck by the larger issues and faith, politics, the region, and the like. So I have been blessed to have those opportunities. I graduated college and I came to Washington, as many of us do, and I had the pleasure of working with Liz Schreier when I was 22 years old. So it's taken me to where I am today, but the validation of that every day in the job, in the people and the stories that I get to see in the field, it is an absolute honor.
Carrie.
Yes, I mean, the pivot point for me came with my Peace Corps experience as a volunteer in Western Samoa in the early 80s. I had been a political science and economics major before that and had thought I would go on to law. And then I met Losa, who was my host mother. and she was about 8 years older than me, but had 8 children already, and became pregnant with her 9th while I was there. And going through that pregnancy with her, I should say that she delivered every single one of her babies on the floor of her thatched roof hut, attended by her elderly mother-in-law. And when she became pregnant with this 9th child, I asked her, where are you going to go for prenatal care? She had never received prenatal care in her entire life, even though there was a very well-stocked clinic 1 mile away on a good road. So any health planner would have told you that she had excellent access. She had never utilized it. And so, you know, my role in it was I took her to that clinic for the very first time. There was an incredibly wise midwife there who befriended her and got to know the family and eventually persuaded her husband that she should deliver with the trained provider in a facility where she would be safe, because she was a very high-risk pregnancy and she nearly lost her life in that pregnancy, but happily she lived. And seeing the lack of access that she had, even though she lived on a good road, really made me want to dedicate my life to maternal and child health, which was what my career was for many, many years until I came back to Peace Corps, which has been a huge privilege since it was such an important part of my own professional development.
Thank you for sharing. Gail?
So I'm the one that was the journalist, which means I'm the only person in Washington who's not a lawyer. So, and I've spent more time in the field than I have in Washington. But I've seen a lot of what happens when there isn't development. And a lot of people die, and a lot of people see their rights and opportunities quashed just because they never had the chance. And I think what drives me is that development is the solution, and it works, and we know how to make it work. So if your concern is epidemics and health, if your concern is that people have their equal rights and equal access to dignity and opportunity, if your concern is conflict or peace or corruption or violence or gender or children, development is the best solution there is. And you know, when you're under fire, people say public service is the gift that keeps on giving. I find it's an extraordinary gift. All of us have the opportunity to both find solutions to problems, but wake up in the morning and say our jobs are to make people's lives better, to build the world that we want to see. And that's a hell of a lot of motivation.
Lee, Carrie, Elizabeth, Gail, and Dana, we are all inspired from you and by you, and I can't think of 5 more incredibly powerful leaders and women that we look forward to carrying your message forward on Capitol Hill tomorrow. Thank you.
Hold on. Let's just say 6.
They're extraordinary. I thank all of you. It was a fabulous conversation. Now you get to dig in a little deeper and you get to eat lunch. We have 5 concurrent breakout sessions that will begin at 12:15. The list is in your program, and I think somewhere on the screen behind me. Our staff will direct you to where they are. You pick up your lunch, you go to the sessions, and we'll be back here in this room for our election 2016 afternoon plenaries. Thank you again, and enjoy your lunch sessions.